It was a crisp evening in New York City, and inside the bustling studio of The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon, the excitement was palpable. The crowd was already buzzing with energy, waiting for the show to begin. For many, this late-night talk show had become a staple of their lives, a place to unwind, laugh, and forget about the stresses of the day. Each episode promised a mix of comedy, celebrity interviews, and quirky games, all wrapped in Jimmy Fallon's signature light-hearted style. Tonight, however, felt a little different. The guest for the evening was someone who didn't need much introduction. He was an actor who had become a cultural icon, known for his deep humility and grounded nature. Keanu Reeves. Whether it was his roles in The Matrix or the John Wick series, Keanu had earned a reputation as the quiet, thoughtful, and downright nice guy in Hollywood, a rare breed in an industry often filled with larger-than-life personalities. For Jimmy Fallon, hosting Keanu was a bit of a dream come true. He had interviewed countless celebrities over the years, but Keanu was different. There was something about him that made people feel safe, like he wasn't just there to promote his latest project or dish out rehearsed stories for laughs. No, Keanu was known for offering something more: realness. Something rare in the world of flashy interviews and scripted responses. The audience filed in, some taking their seats while others were still catching up with friends or taking selfies for social media. The familiar backdrop of the studio shimmered in soft lights and the stage was set. It was a standard opening for any Tonight Show episode. The band played its cheerful jazzy intro. Jimmy Fallon entered with his usual enthusiasm, waving to the crowd, his face lit up with that unmistakable smile. The audience cheered as he made his way to the desk. "Welcome everyone to another amazing episode of The Tonight Show. We've got a great show tonight," Jimmy announced. "Our first guest is a man who needs no introduction. He's a beloved actor, a legendary star, and just a genuinely kind human being. Please give a warm welcome to Keanu Reeves." As the audience erupted into applause, Keanu made his entrance, casually walking out from behind the curtain. His presence immediately quieted the room, not because of any overwhelming charisma, but because of his grounded, almost serene demeanor. He waved slightly, a humble smile on his face, before sitting down beside Jimmy. "Keanu, man, it's so great to have you here," Jimmy said, clearly excited. "You know, we've been wanting to have you on this show for years." "It's finally happening." Keanu chuckled lightly, his calm voice filling the room. "Yeah, it's good to be here, Jimmy. I'm glad we could make this work." The audience was on edge with anticipation. Keanu had always been an enigma to his fans. He wasn't flashy. He didn't try to attract attention to himself off-screen. Instead, he lived his life quietly, giving interviews every now and then, but always staying true to who he was. It was a rare trait for someone in Hollywood, and that's what made him so universally adored. "All right, so let's get into it," Jimmy began, sitting up a little straighter. "You've been in the business for decades now. But I gotta ask, how do you stay so grounded? So it's real? I mean, you've seen it all, right?" Keanu looked at him, clearly amused. He leaned forward in his chair, his body language warm yet reserved, as if he was taking a moment to really consider the question before responding. "Well, I don't know if I'd say I've seen it all," he said thoughtfully. "But yeah, it's been a long ride. There's definitely a lot of ups and downs in this industry, but I think the key is remembering what matters, and honestly, not getting too caught up in the noise. It's easy to get distracted by all the attention, the fame, the recognition, but none of that really defines who you are." The audience was hanging on every word. There was a sincerity to Keanu's voice that made it feel like he wasn't just talking for the sake of it. He was sharing something real, something that came from his personal experience. Jimmy nodded, clearly impressed by the depth of the response. "I love that," Jimmy said, leaning back in his chair. "You know, you've made a career out of playing these action-packed, larger-than-life roles. But when I talk to you like this, it's like you're just a regular guy. It's kind of amazing." Keanu smiled softly, but there was no hint of pride in his expression. It was more like he was reflecting on a truth he'd come to understand over the years. "I think we're all just regular people, Jimmy," he replied, his tone humble. "We all have our struggles, our challenges. But I think what matters most is the way we treat each other along the way." The audience was completely quiet now, hanging on his every word. It wasn't often that someone in Keanu's position would speak so openly about their perspective on life, especially not in front of a live television audience. People expected celebrities to be polished, to give the usual rehearsed answers. But Keanu was different. His words carried weight because they felt unfiltered, almost like he wasn't just performing for the cameras. Jimmy looked at him, clearly touched by the honesty. "I gotta say, man, you've got this incredible way of just cutting through all the noise. And I think people really connect with that. They see you as, well, as someone they can trust." Keanu shrugged, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I appreciate that, Jimmy. But I don't really see myself that way. I just try to be myself and hope that's enough." The crowd, still mesmerized, couldn't help but respond with a round of applause. It wasn't the usual applause of excitement that came after a joke or a funny story. This was different. It was genuine appreciation for the authenticity Keanu was sharing with them. Jimmy, now more relaxed in his chair, grinned and looked out at the audience. "I think everyone in this room would agree. You've definitely earned that trust." Keanu nodded, his eyes never leaving Jimmy's. "I guess I've learned over the years that trust is something you have to build. Slowly, by being consistent and true to yourself. It doesn't come overnight." The conversation continued, with Jimmy gently guiding the topic from Keanu's career to his personal life, but the energy in the room had shifted. It was as if everyone could feel the sincerity of the moment, that rare sense of connection between a celebrity and an audience that went beyond the typical performance. As they spoke about his latest projects and the challenges of staying grounded in a world that often encouraged anything but. Keanu's calmness seemed to calm everyone around him. Even the crew in the back seemed to be listening more attentively than usual. There was something magnetic about his quiet wisdom, something that felt deeply human. Jimmy, ever the professional, kept the conversation flowing. But behind his usual humor and playful banter, it was clear he was captivated by what Keanu was saying. As the first segment of the show came to an end, the audience was left with a feeling that couldn't quite be put into words. They had just witnessed something different, a conversation that felt more like an intimate exchange than a staged interview. And yet, this was just the beginning. What was about to unfold next would be even more unexpected. Something was coming that no one could have predicted, least of all Jimmy Fallon himself. As the first segment of the show wrapped up, the audience was still buzzing with the energy of Keanu's heartfelt words. Jimmy Fallon, having come off the initial shock of the deep, reflective moment, was ready to dive into another part of the conversation. He glanced at Keanu, who was sitting calmly, almost like a man who had already lived through the roller coaster of fame and was content with his place in the world. "All right, Keanu," Jimmy said, his tone light, but there was a certain softness to it now. "Let's talk a bit more about your career. You've had some of the most iconic roles in Hollywood, and yet you're not exactly the typical Hollywood star. I mean, you're not the one to post endless selfies or share every little thing on social media. What's your take on all of that? How do you stay away from all the noise?" Keanu chuckled softly, and for a moment he seemed to consider the question. His eyes, which had a certain calm intensity, looked out at the audience as if he was reflecting on his own experiences before answering. "Well, I think part of it is that I've never really felt the need to be on social media," he said, his voice steady but thoughtful. "It's not that I'm against it or that I don't understand why people enjoy it. It's just that I've always preferred to focus on the work I'm doing, the people I'm with, and the moments that actually matter to me. I think a lot of the world is caught up in this constant need for validation, and sometimes that can be distracting." Jimmy nodded, clearly intrigued. "So you don't feel that pressure to keep up with everyone else?" Keanu shook his head, his face thoughtful. "Not really. I've always been someone who prefers to stay grounded in reality. I think social media, while it's great in many ways, also tends to create this illusion that we're all supposed to be constantly on, always performing for others. But the truth is, real connections happen in person. They happen when we're fully present." The room was quiet again, and Jimmy, who had a knack for keeping things light, found himself pausing for a moment before continuing. He had heard similar sentiments from other celebrities, but there was something different in Keanu's delivery. It wasn't just words. It was a philosophy that had clearly shaped his life. It was clear that Keanu wasn't just saying this to sound wise. He actually lived by it. "You know, I think that's one of the reasons why people love you so much," Jimmy said with a genuine smile. "You don't try to be anything other than yourself. You've been in this industry for years, but you're not out there looking for attention. It's refreshing." Keanu smiled, but there was no hint of arrogance in his expression. It was more of a quiet acknowledgement of the truth behind Jimmy's words. I think it comes down to this, Keanu said, his voice still calm but carrying a quiet strength. We spend so much time trying to be something we're not. We want to be liked, we want to be admired, and sometimes we lose sight of the fact that we're already enough as we are. We all have value, without having to prove anything to anyone. There was a long pause after he spoke. The audience, which had been laughing and clapping moments earlier, was now absorbed in what Keanu had just said. Jimmy, who was known for being the life of the party, seemed unusually quiet, processing Keanu's words. So, Keanu, Jimmy said after a beat, clearly trying to shift the tone back to something a bit more lighthearted. I gotta ask you, how do you handle it when people recognize you? I mean, you walk down the street and someone's like, hey, that's Keanu Reeves. How does that feel? Keanu let out a soft laugh, and for a moment he seemed to relax. You know, it's always a little surreal. I mean, I've been in the public eye for a long time, but I never got used to the attention. It's nice when people are kind, but honestly, I prefer when people just treat me like a regular person. I'm just a guy doing my job, and I don't really need to be treated differently. Jimmy smiled, sensing the familiar modesty that Keanu exuded. I think that's why people connect with you. You're just real. You don't have that star attitude, and people love that. Keanu nodded, the humility in his expression never wavering. I appreciate that, Jimmy. But I think it's important to remember that none of us are above anyone else. We all have our own lives, our struggles, and our dreams. No matter how much success or fame someone has, we're all just people trying to make the best of our time here. There it was again, the quiet wisdom that had become Keanu's trademark. The audience was hanging on every word, as though they were soaking up some kind of rare truth. Jimmy, who had hosted many stars on his show, was clearly struck by how effortlessly Keanu could speak on such deep topics without making it feel heavy or forced. As the conversation continued, Jimmy tried to bring the focus back to the lighter, funnier side of Keanu's career. They talked about his iconic roles, his experiences on set, and his approach to acting. But even as the topic shifted, Keanu's calm presence remained, and the deeper, more meaningful aspects of the conversation lingered in the air. You've done some intense roles over the years, especially in John Wick. How do you prepare for something like that? Jimmy asked, clearly fascinated. Keanu leaned back slightly, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest of his chair. Well, it takes a lot of preparation. I train, I learn the fight choreography, and I get into the mindset of the character. But the most important part is understanding why the character does what they do. It's not just about the action, it's about the emotion behind it. Why is this character driven to take the actions they do? Jimmy nodded, clearly impressed by the thoughtful answer. So it's not just about being a badass on screen. There's more to it than that. Keanu smiled slightly. Exactly. If you don't understand the emotional journey of the character, the action becomes meaningless. It's the heart of the character that drives everything else. The conversation shifted again, and as the segment wore on, Jimmy kept things moving smoothly. But the audience was still deeply engaged, their attention fixed on every word that Keanu spoke. There was something about the way he carried himself, his humility, his quiet thoughtfulness, that made the conversation feel less like a show and more like a shared moment of honesty. At one point, Jimmy brought up Keanu's reputation for kindness. He mentioned how stories of Keanu's generous acts had surfaced over the years, like the time he gave up a portion of his The Matrix earnings to the special effects crew, or how he'd quietly donated large sums to children's hospitals without drawing any attention to himself. Keanu nodded as Jimmy mentioned these stories, but he didn't seem interested in dwelling on them. I don't like to talk about it, Keanu said simply. If I can help someone, I do it because it feels right, not because I want recognition. I think we all have the ability to make the world a better place, even in small ways. It's not about grand gestures. It's about showing up for others when it counts. It was at that moment, perhaps more than any other during the interview, that the full scope of Keanu's character became clear. He wasn't just an actor or a celebrity. He was someone who genuinely cared about the people around him. He was someone who, despite being at the top of his field, had never lost sight of the importance of human connection, kindness, and generosity. As the segment came to a close, Jimmy gave Keanu one last thoughtful look. You know, Keanu, you're a rare breed in Hollywood. There's just something about you that makes people feel like they can trust you. It's not often you come across someone who's so genuine, especially in this business. Keanu smiled softly, nodding. I appreciate that, Jimmy. But I think we all have the ability to be real with each other. It's just a matter of choosing to be honest, to be kind, and to treat others with respect. With that, the audience erupted into applause again, this time with a warmth that felt almost reverent. Keanu's words had left a lasting impression on everyone in the room. It wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a conversation that had touched on something deeply human. And as the segment ended, Jimmy Fallon couldn't help but feel grateful for having witnessed it. As the lights dimmed and the show transitioned to the next segment, the audience was still processing what they had just heard. Keanu's words had stirred something inside them, something that went beyond the typical celebrity chatter. And little did they know, this was just the beginning. The night had settled into a steady rhythm. The interview with Keanu had moved smoothly, but there was an unmistakable shift in the atmosphere. Something about the way he spoke, his honesty and the wisdom behind his words had left the audience in a reflective mood. Jimmy Fallon, ever the professional, tried to keep the energy up, but even he could feel the weight of the conversation. As the show progressed, Jimmy moved the conversation into a lighter space, attempting to bring the focus back to Keanu's career. He was, after all, known for his action-packed roles and thrilling performances on screen. But as the audience had already learned, there was so much more to Keanu than what met the eye. The usual banter, the jokes, the games, it all seemed almost out of place now. The real conversation, the one that felt authentic, was still lingering in the air, but Jimmy was nothing if not adaptable. With his usual charm, he smoothly transitioned to the next topic. So, Keanu, let's talk about your latest role. You've been absolutely crushing it in the John Wick series. It's incredible how those films have become such a huge cultural phenomenon, Jimmy said, eager to dive into more familiar waters. Keanu smiled, a soft chuckle escaping his lips. Yeah, it's kind of crazy, isn't it? I mean, I didn't expect it to blow up the way it did. I can't even count how many memes and GIFs there are of you from those movies, Jimmy responded, a playful grin crossing his face. It's like you're everywhere. You've become an internet icon. Keanu laughed again, but this time there was a certain humility in his reaction. It's all a little surreal. I mean, I just do my best to bring the character to life. The fans, the memes, honestly, I don't really understand it, but I'm glad people enjoy it. If anything, it just makes me appreciate the work even more. It's nice to see how something you've worked on resonates with so many people. Jimmy nodded, clearly impressed by Keanu's grounded response. You know, I've always wondered, how do you prepare for a role like that? I mean, John Wick is intense. It's not just about the fighting and action. It's also about the emotional weight the character carries. How do you get into that headspace? Keanu leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful as he considered the question. For me, it's about understanding the character's pain and why they do what they do. John Wick is a man who's lost everything, and his journey is about trying to find redemption, to survive in a world that doesn't make sense to him anymore. The action is a reflection of that emotional journey. You can't just go through the motions of fighting and shooting. You have to understand the deeper emotions that drive those actions. The audience was listening intently, hanging on every word. There was something about Keanu's approach to acting that felt different. He didn't just see his roles as performances, he saw them as emotional explorations. It wasn't just about being in the spotlight, about the fame or the recognition. It was about bringing depth to the characters he portrayed. Jimmy, clearly fascinated by this perspective, leaned in. That's so interesting. It's almost like you're not just playing a character, you're living in their shoes. I imagine that must make those fight scenes a little more intense, right? Keanu nodded. Exactly. The action scenes are not just about the physicality. They have to carry the weight of everything the character has gone through. If the audience doesn't feel the emotional drive behind the action, then it's just a bunch of punches and kicks. But when it connects with the audience on a deeper level, it becomes something more. As he spoke, Jimmy's respect for Keanu grew even more. It was clear that the actor didn't take any of his work for granted. For Keanu, every role was an opportunity to dig deeper, to explore the human condition. Whether it was an action-packed thriller or a smaller, more intimate drama, he always approached his roles with the same level of dedication and thoughtfulness. You know, Jimmy said, a slight smile creeping onto his face. I think that's why people love you so much. You're not just a guy who does cool stunts. You're a guy who really cares about the stories you're telling. Keanu's smile was soft, but there was a depth to it. "I think we all have stories to tell," he replied. "And sometimes the most important stories are the ones that don't get told. I'm just lucky that I get to be part of telling some of them." The words hung in the air for a moment and the audience was silent. It wasn't often that an actor opened up this much about the craft, about the meaning behind their roles. Keanu's sincerity was palpable, and it had the effect of making everyone around him want to be just a little bit more thoughtful, a little more reflective. As the interview continued, Jimmy asked about some of Keanu's other notable roles, like his time in the Matrix series. Keanu, ever the professional, spoke with enthusiasm about the groundbreaking work they had done on those films. But even as he spoke about the action and the visual effects, there was always an underlying current of depth in his responses. "You know, people often talk about The Matrix as a groundbreaking movie in terms of special effects, but it's more than that," Keanu said. "It's really a story about waking up to the truth, about questioning the world around you." "I think that's something we all can relate to no matter what generation we come from." Jimmy nodded, clearly impressed. "Yeah, that's the thing about those movies, they're timeless. The message is still relevant today, probably more than ever," Keanu agreed. "The idea of questioning reality, the idea of choice, the idea of breaking free from systems that control us. That's something that resonates with people across the world. And that's what makes those films stand the test of time. It's not just the action or the effects, it's the deeper meaning behind it." For the first time in the interview, Jimmy paused for a moment, taking in the weight of Keanu's words. He had spent his career interviewing celebrities, many of whom had offered their fair share of sound bites and rehearsed lines. But Keanu was different. He wasn't just talking about his career or his successes. He was talking about something bigger, something that transcended Hollywood. "Wow," Jimmy said finally, his voice softer than usual. "I think a lot of people don't realize how much depth goes into your roles. They just see the action, the big fight scenes, but there's so much more there. I mean, you've been a part of some of the most iconic films of all time, and you're not just doing it for the fame. You're doing it to tell stories that matter." Keanu shrugged slightly as if it were no big deal. "I don't think it's about fame. It's about doing something that feels true, that feels real. The fame is just a byproduct of that. At the end of the day, I'm just trying to do my best to tell stories that move people." As the conversation continued, it became clear that this wasn't just an interview about a Hollywood star's career. This was an exploration of a person who had spent his life navigating fame, success, and personal challenges with grace and humility. Keanu wasn't just an actor. He was a philosopher of sorts, someone who used his roles as a way to communicate deeper truths about life. But as the night wore on, something unexpected happened. Jimmy, sensing an opportunity, decided to bring the conversation into more personal territory. He had heard rumors about Keanu's experiences in the industry, stories about his kindness, his generosity, and his down-to-earth nature. Jimmy had always been curious about these stories and wanted to know more. "Keanu," Jimmy began, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "there's something I've always wanted to ask you. There are so many stories about your generosity, like how you've given away a portion of your salary to the crew on your films, or how you've quietly donated large sums to charity. Why do you do that?" Keanu looked down for a moment as if the question had caught him off guard. He then met Jimmy's eyes, his expression calm. "I think it's just about doing what feels right. I've been fortunate enough to have a career that's allowed me to do things I love. But there are so many people who work behind the scenes, people who don't get the recognition they deserve. I just want to give back to them in whatever way I can." Jimmy was silent for a moment, clearly moved by Keanu's response. The audience, too, seemed to absorb the sincerity of his words. It was clear that Keanu wasn't just doing these acts of kindness for attention. He was doing them because it felt like the right thing to do. And in that moment, it became evident why people loved him so much. He wasn't just an actor or a public figure. He was, above all, a decent human being. The conversation had moved into a deeper, more reflective space, and the atmosphere in the studio had changed. The lively energy of the earlier moments had settled into a quieter, more contemplative mood. The audience, still hanging on every word Keanu spoke, seemed to be on a journey with him, not just listening to an actor talk about his craft, but connecting to a deeper philosophy of life. As Keanu's words continued to resonate with the viewers, Jimmy Fallon, who had a knack for shifting the mood with ease, couldn't help but ask the question that had been on his mind for a while. It was one of those questions that could only be asked in a setting like this, where the atmosphere was calm and the audience was listening intently. "Keanu," Jimmy began, his tone gentle, "I've got to ask you about something that everyone seems to be curious about. You've been in the public eye for decades now, and yet you've managed to remain one of the most down-to-earth, humble people in Hollywood. So here's the question. How do you stay so grounded?" Keanu seemed to pause for a moment, almost as if he had been expecting this question. He gave a small smile, the kind that made you feel like you were hearing a secret, a truth he rarely shared with the world. "I think it comes down to remembering where I come from," he said, his voice steady but soft. "At the end of the day, we're all just people. No matter how much fame, money, or success you get, it doesn't change the fact that you're still a human being. You're still just a person trying to make sense of the world around you, trying to find happiness and peace." Jimmy leaned in slightly, his curiosity piqued. "That's really profound. So what keeps you grounded then? What makes you remember that? Especially in a world where it's so easy to get caught up in the chaos of fame." Keanu's eyes seemed to soften as he thought about the question. For a moment he didn't speak. It was as if he was carefully considering his answer, searching for the right words. The pause only deepened the impact of what he said next. "It's the people around me," he said simply. "I've always been surrounded by people who remind me of who I really am. I have close friends, family, and even people I've met along the way who keep me grounded. They don't treat me like a star or a celebrity. They treat me like a regular person, and I think that's so important." There was something about Keanu's calmness, his humility, that made everything he said feel so authentic. The audience could feel it too. They could sense that this wasn't just an actor playing a role. This was a real person who had a sense of self that wasn't defined by fame. And for the first time in a long while, Jimmy found himself reflecting on that too. "Wow," Jimmy said almost in awe. "You make it sound so simple, but I think that's something a lot of people forget in this business. They get swept up in the image and the idea of who they're supposed to be rather than just being themselves." Keanu nodded. "Yeah, it's easy to get lost in the idea of fame, of what people expect from you. But I think the key is to remember that none of that matters in the grand scheme of things. What really matters is being true to who you are, staying kind and making meaningful connections with the people who matter." There was a brief silence as both Jimmy and the audience absorbed his words. Keanu had a way of simplifying complex thoughts, making them feel like universal truths that anyone could apply to their own lives. "I guess that's why people really connect with you," Jimmy said, a smile tugging at his lips. "It's because you don't buy into the Hollywood persona. You just, you." Keanu's smile was modest but sincere. "I think we all have that power, to just be ourselves. And it's a powerful thing. We don't need to put on a mask to feel validated." Jimmy nodded thoughtfully, then shifted gears a little. "All right, let's change the topic a bit. You've done so many different kinds of roles throughout your career, from the action-packed John Wick movies to the sci-fi world of The Matrix. But you've also done some smaller, more intimate films. Do you have a preference for one type of role over another?" Keanu's expression changed slightly, as if he was considering the question from different angles. "I don't really have a preference, honestly. It's not about the size of the role or the genre for me. It's about whether the character feels real, whether the story is something I can connect with. I want to be part of stories that move people, stories that make a difference in some way." He paused for a second, then added, "And I think that's why I've done such a wide range of films. I'm not just looking for the next big action movie or blockbuster. I want to explore different aspects of life, different emotions, and I want to see the world through different perspectives. That's what makes acting exciting for me." Jimmy nodded, clearly intrigued. "So you're not chasing after fame. You're chasing after meaningful experiences, both as an actor and as a person?" Keanu's eyes sparkled for a brief moment as he replied, "Exactly. Fame comes and goes. But the work, the experience of diving into different characters and learning about the human experience, that's what stays with me." The audience, which had been captivated by every word, now sat in rapt silence, digesting the depth of Keanu's perspective. It wasn't just about being in the spotlight. It wasn't about being a household name. It was about the journey, the stories, and the emotional truths that connected us all. "So, when you're not working on set," Jimmy asked, "trying to keep the flow of the conversation going, how do you unwind? What do you do to relax? Because I'm sure being in the public eye all the time can get exhausting." Keanu thought for a moment before answering. "I like to keep things simple," he said with a slight smile. I'm not really into flashy vacations or extravagant lifestyles. I love spending time with the people I care about. Whether that's having a quiet dinner with friends, going for a walk, or just enjoying some time to myself. I also love riding motorcycles. It's a way to clear my head, to be in the moment. Motorcycles, huh? Jimmy grinned. I have to admit that's kind of a Keanu thing. The Matrix guy, the John Wick guy. Of course you'd love motorcycles. Does it help you clear your mind, though? Keanu nodded. Yeah, it's a way to disconnect from everything else, to be present. I love the feeling of freedom and focus that comes with it. It's almost like a meditation. The audience chuckled lightly, enjoying the image of Keanu, the action star, finding peace in something as simple as riding a motorcycle. It seemed to fit perfectly with the persona he had built over the years. Grounded, humble, and ever so relatable. Jimmy smiled and shifted in his chair. All right, Keanu. Before we wrap things up, I've got one last question for you. If you could give one piece of advice to anyone out there who looks up to you, who admires your work and your outlook on life, what would you say? Keanu leaned forward slightly, his gaze focused and intense. He spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully as if he was sharing something personal. Be kind, he said, his voice firm yet gentle, to yourself and to others. Life can be tough, and it's easy to get caught up in the noise, in the competition and the pressure. But at the end of the day, what really matters is how you treat others and how you treat yourself. Stay grounded, stay humble, and never lose sight of what's truly important. There was a long silence in the studio as Keanu's words settled in. The message was simple, but it carried weight. The audience, now deeply moved by the conversation, began to applaud. It wasn't just applause for the actor on stage. It was applause for the man who had just shared his truth, his perspective on life. Jimmy, still in awe, joined in the applause. Keanu, that's beautiful. Seriously, thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. You're one of a kind. Keanu smiled softly, his usual humility shining through. Thank you, Jimmy, it's been a pleasure. And with that, the segment ended. But the impact of Keanu's words lingered long after the cameras stopped rolling. For the audience, it wasn't just another celebrity interview. It had been a moment of genuine connection, a reminder of what it meant to be human, to be kind, and to never lose sight of the simple truths that guide us through life. As the applause gradually faded, Keanu leaned back in his chair, his calm presence still filling the space. Jimmy took a moment to compose himself as the audience continued to cheer, but he could tell that the energy had shifted. It wasn't just a typical late-night talk show now. This had become something more. Keanu had taken everyone on a journey, sharing a part of himself that was deeper and more meaningful than anyone had expected. Jimmy turned toward the camera, his usual bright smile back in place. Well, folks, if that wasn't a masterclass in humility and wisdom, I don't know what is. Keanu, thank you for sharing so much of yourself with us tonight. Keanu smiled and nodded, his eyes soft with gratitude. It was clear to everyone in the room that he wasn't doing this for the attention or the applause. He was simply being himself, and that authenticity was what made him so admired. But before we let you go, Jimmy added, I think we'd all like to know, what's next for Keanu Reeves? What can we expect from you in the future? Keanu paused for a moment, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his lips. I'm always looking for new stories to tell, he said, his voice steady but filled with purpose. There are always opportunities to grow, both as an actor and as a person. I don't know exactly what the future holds, but I know that I'll keep looking for roles that challenge me, that teach me something new. Jimmy nodded, clearly understanding. That's the thing about you, Keanu. You never stop learning, never stop pushing yourself. You're always evolving, and that's what keeps your work so fresh and meaningful. Keanu looked at Jimmy, his gaze thoughtful. I think that's true for all of us. Life is about evolving, about learning, and about growing. If you stop learning, you stop growing. And when that happens, you start to lose sight of what's really important. The audience sat quietly, hanging on every word. It wasn't just Keanu's career they were admiring anymore. It was his whole approach to life, his genuine humility, his commitment to personal growth, and his ability to stay true to who he was no matter what. Well, Jimmy said, grinning, I think we can all agree that no matter what you do next, we'll be excited to see it, and I know we're all rooting for you. Keanu smiled, his usual modesty taking over. Thank you, Jimmy, that means a lot. With the conversation winding down, Jimmy turned back to the audience, All right, folks, before we wrap things up, let's take a moment to appreciate what we just heard. Keanu isn't just a movie star or an action hero. He's a real person with a real heart. And we're lucky to have him in the world of entertainment. The audience responded with another round of applause, the sincerity of their appreciation evident. It was clear that Keanu had left an impact on everyone in the room, not just through his roles on screen, but through the person he was off screen as well. As the applause died down, Jimmy added, "Keanu, thank you again for being here. You've given us so much to think about tonight, and we can't wait to see what you do next." Keanu nodded, his eyes twinkling with warmth. "It's been a pleasure, Jimmy. Thanks for having me." With that, the segment came to a close, but the feeling lingered long after. The audience slowly began to file out, chatting quietly amongst themselves, but you could tell that everyone was leaving with a sense of something deeper. It wasn't just another celebrity interview. It had been an opportunity to connect with someone who had something important to say. Someone who reminded us that the simplest truths are often the most powerful. As Keanu left the stage, Jimmy sat back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. He glanced at the crew who were busy packing up and preparing for the next segment, but he couldn't help but reflect on the conversation that had just unfolded. It had been one of those rare moments in television where everything aligned, where an interview became more than just a chat. It had become a lesson in life. The crew, who had been silently observing the entire interview, began to talk amongst themselves. "Wow," one of the producers said. "That was something else. He really doesn't seem like he's from this world." Another crew member nodded. "Yeah, it's like he's on a different level. There's no ego, no facade, just pure, unfiltered humanity." It wasn't just the crew who felt this way. Back in the studio, the audience had been moved not just by Keanu's words, but by his authenticity. They had come expecting to see an actor, a star, but what they got was a human being who had lived through the highs and lows of life, and had come out the other side wiser and more grounded than most. As the show concluded and the lights dimmed, Jimmy stood up and turned to his staff. "I think that was one of the best interviews I've ever had," he said. And it wasn't just about the career stuff. It was about Keanu as a person, what he stands for, the way he lives his life. That's what people really connect with. The team nodded in agreement. It was one of those rare moments in television where the scripted lines and jokes didn't matter. It was about the real connection that had happened in that room. A connection that had left everyone with something to think about long after the show had ended. As Keanu made his way out of the studio, he was met with the usual hustle and bustle of the post-show routine. The crew, ever professional, moved swiftly to pack up equipment, but even they couldn't help but offer quiet words of praise as he passed. "Thanks for being so real," one of the camera operators said.